In the summer of 1969, the most celebrated meal being eaten in America was not served at a Michelin-starred restaurant in Manhattan. It was not at any of the 16 rooftop restaurants of Stouffer's Corporation, including their landmark penthouse dining room atop 666 Fifth Avenue in New York City. The most celebrated meal in America was being eaten in a quarantine facility at the Johnson Space Center in Houston, Texas, by 3 astronauts who had just walked on the moon. And the company feeding them was Stouffer's. Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, and Michael Collins had returned from the Apollo 11 mission to a mandatory 21-day quarantine. And the food that greeted them, breakfast, lunch, Sunday, and dinner for 3 full weeks, was prepared by the same company that had started as a buttermilk stand in the lower level of a Cleveland arcade in 1922. Stouffer's was so proud of this moment that they built an advertising campaign around it. The tagline ran in newspapers and magazines across the country: "Everybody who's been to the moon is eating Stouffer's." It was 1969. The company had 68 restaurants. It was entering the hotel business with properties that would eventually span the United States, Mexico, the Caribbean, and Hawaii. Its 42-acre frozen food processing plant in Solon, Ohio, one of the most technologically advanced food manufacturing facilities in the world, had just opened the year before. Stouffer's Corporation had annual sales that were the envy of the prepared food industry. The family that had started it all with $15,000 and a lunch counter was now a publicly traded American institution. They did not know it, but they were at the peak. Not the commercial peak. That would come during the Lean Cuisine eruption of the early 1980s, but the peak of something more fundamental. The moment when the name Stouffer's meant something complete and unified, when the restaurants and the hotels and the frozen food and the brand were all pulling in the same direction under the same name. 17 years later, the restaurants would begin to close. 24 years later, the hotels would be sold. 47 years later, Canada, the only other country that carried the brand, would stop selling Stouffer's products entirely. The company that fed the men who walked on the moon was quietly becoming something smaller, something more corporate, something that no longer quite belonged to itself. This is the story of the rise that made Stouffer's untouchable, the peak that put them in orbit, and the fall that happened not with a crash, but with a slow, systematic erasure of everything that made them more than just another box in the frozen food aisle. Welcome inside the factory where America once came to eat and then forgot it had. 1922. The Cleveland Arcade, Cleveland, Ohio. The Cleveland Arcade is one of the most beautiful buildings in Ohio. A 5-story Victorian glass-roofed shopping hall opened in 1890 and modeled on the great covered arcades of Europe, its iron balconies rising in tiers toward a soaring skyline of iron and glass. In 1922, on the lower level of that arcade, Abraham Stouffer and his wife Lena Mahala Bigelow Stouffer converted a small dairy stand owned by the family creamery into something slightly more ambitious. They began serving buttermilk, cheese sandwiches, and free crackers. And then, Lena Stouffer began baking her deep dish Dutch apple pie. That pie, by all accounts of people who were there, was the reason everything happened. The warm, deep dish, homemade quality of it drew people who came for the buttermilk and stayed for the pie. They came back. They told others. The modest stand that was meant to sustain the family's creamery business began drawing more customers than the creamery itself. Abraham had allegedly conceived the basic idea of a quick-service lunch system before 1920, watching the lunch patterns of downtown Cleveland workers who needed something fast, filling, and decent at a price that made sense. The arcade stand was the proof of concept. Abraham and Lena's eldest son, Vernon, graduated from the Wharton School of Finance at the University of Pennsylvania in 1923 and returned home to join the growing operation. He had his father's instinct for what people wanted to eat and his mother's uncompromising standard for how it should be prepared. Secured with $15,000 in starting capital, the family opened their first true restaurant in 1924 at the corner of East 9th Street and Euclid Avenue in the Cleveland Citizens Building. The menu was modest, 4 sandwiches priced between 20 and 25 cents, but the quality and the service were exactly what downtown Cleveland workers had been waiting for. They incorporated as Stouffer lunch systems. Brother Gordon joined the operation in 1929, and the two sons reorganized the business and took it public as the Stouffer Corporation, with Abraham serving as chairman of the board. That same year, the company expanded outside Ohio for the first time, opening locations in Detroit and Pittsburgh. The company's motto, established by Gordon, captured the operating philosophy precisely. Everybody is somebody at Stouffer's. It was not a slogan about food. It was a statement about how people should feel when they walked through the door, seen, respected, and well served. Abraham Stouffer died in 1936, before the company had begun to understand just how large it would eventually become. He had started with buttermilk and pie. His sons would build the rest of it. The restaurant chain that reached New York in 1937, the frozen food division that would become a national institution, the hotels that would line up prestigious properties across 2 continents. But the foundation he had laid was the one that everything else rested on: quality, consistency, the conviction that ordinary people deserved an extraordinary meal. The shadow of what was coming had not yet fallen on Stouffer's, not remotely. But the forces that would eventually reshape the entire American food industry were already beginning to organize themselves quietly, far from the Cleveland arcade. 1929 to 1953, Cleveland, Ohio, and beyond. Vernon Stouffer, born on August 22, 1901, was the kind of business leader who tested products himself and secretly checked quality at his own restaurants when traveling, arriving unannounced and ordering off the menu like any other customer to see if what was being served met his personal standard. He was not a man who delegated his convictions. He carried them personally into every corner of the operation. Under his leadership through the 1930s and 40s, Stouffer's expanded systematically. The company opened in Philadelphia in 1931. New York City arrived in 1937, the chain's 7th location. Each restaurant was known for what the Encyclopedia of Cleveland History described as high-quality food and drink at affordable prices in pleasant surroundings, built on expert food preparation in the most modern kitchen facilities. The uniforms of the Stouffer waitresses were standardized. The menu quality was non-negotiable. The experience of walking into a Stouffer's restaurant anywhere in the country was supposed to feel consistent, to feel like the same trustworthy institution had prepared your meal with the same care, regardless of the city. The Second World War curtailed the company's expansion for several years, but when it ended, something happened that neither Vernon nor anyone else in the industry had anticipated. Something small, specific, and local that would change the direction of American food forever. In 1946, Stouffer's opened its first suburban restaurant location at Shaker Square in Cleveland. The manager of that location was a man named Wally Blankenship. Customers at the Shaker Square restaurant began doing something that restaurant managers typically resist. They started asking to take the food home. Not the ingredients, not the recipes. The food, already cooked, ready to eat, in the form they had just enjoyed at the table. They wanted portions of the macaroni and cheese, the spinach souffle, the Salisbury steak, frozen to be reheated at home. Blankenship recognized what this meant before anyone else did. He opened a small separate retail business next to the Shaker Square restaurant called the 227 Club, named for the address, that sold frozen versions of the restaurant's most popular menu items. The concept spread immediately to other Stouffer's locations. Customers bought the frozen meals as though they had been waiting for someone to invent this category. The food was not mass-produced or industrially formulated. It was restaurant food, frozen, and there was no competition in that quality tier of the emerging frozen food market. The irony that would take decades to fully express itself was already present in this moment of triumph. The thing that would eventually make Stouffer's most famous was also the thing that would eventually make the restaurants unnecessary. 1954 to 1967. Cleveland and Solon, Ohio. By 1954, Stouffer's restaurants were serving over 14 million meals per year across the chain. The demand for frozen menu items, which had begun as an afterthought next to the Shaker Square location, had grown beyond what any restaurant kitchen could sustain. The company built a pilot processing plant in downtown Cleveland on Woodland Avenue in 1953. In 1956, the company formally renamed the food production operation Stouffer Foods Corporation, giving the frozen food side of the business its own institutional identity. By that year, the frozen products were being distributed along both the East and West coasts. What Stouffer's was selling was something that had no real predecessor in the frozen food aisle. Swanson & Sons had introduced their TV dinner in 1953, and those aluminum trays of compartmentalized food were widely available and enormously successful at the low end of the market. But they were designed for convenience and price, not quality. Stouffer's aimed at a completely different consumer, the person who had eaten at a Stouffer's restaurant and wanted that same experience at home. The packaging focused on entrees rather than full meal trays, because restaurant dining was built around the entree. The portions were generous. The quality of the meat and vegetables was held to the same standard the restaurants maintained. In the early 1960s, the company diversified its restaurant operations aggressively. A collection of top-of-penthouse restaurants began in 1958 with the Top of the Sixes, atop Manhattan's 666 Fifth Avenue building, at the time one of the highest public restaurants in New York City, eventually growing into 16 such rooftop dining rooms across major American cities. The Top of the Hub opened in Boston's Prudential Tower. The Top of the Flame opened in 1 Woodward Avenue in Detroit. The Top of the Town opened in Cleveland's Erie View Tower. These were not casual dining rooms. They were destination experiences built on the combination of exceptional food and genuinely extraordinary views. In 1960, Stouffer's purchased its first hotel, the Anacapri Inn in Fort Lauderdale, Florida, and by the end of that year, the company had 3 formal divisions: Stouffer Hotels Corporation, Stouffer Foods Corporation, and Stouffer Restaurants Corporation. In 1962, the company reached Disneyland, operating the Plaza Pavilion restaurant, the Tahitian Terrace, and the French Market restaurant in Anaheim, California. In 1967, Litton Industries, a California-based conglomerate with a large share of the emerging microwave oven market, purchased all 3 Stouffer divisions. The logic was vertical integration. Litton made the ovens. Stouffer made the food that would go in them. The frozen food plant in Cleveland was already straining under demand, and in 1968, under Litton's ownership, Stouffer's opened a 42-acre site in Solon, Ohio, to house a fully modernized and automated frozen food processing plant, complete with quality control, food research, and microbiological laboratories. It was the most advanced facility of its kind in the country. Then the most celebrated food event of the decade gave the company the tagline it would carry for years. But the very same moment of triumph was planting the seed of a question that would take decades to become impossible to answer. What was Stouffer's exactly? Was it a restaurant company, a food manufacturer, a hotel group, All three answers were simultaneously correct. And the problem with all three being correct at the same time was already building quietly in a boardroom in Vevey, Switzerland. 1969 to 1973. Solon, Ohio, and Vevey, Switzerland. Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, and Michael Collins returned from the first moon landing in July of 1969 to a mandatory quarantine at the Lunar Receiving Laboratory at the Johnson Space Center in Houston, Texas. NASA's protocol required the astronauts to spend 21 days in isolation, not because anyone was certain they had brought anything dangerous back from the lunar surface, but because no one was certain they had not. For those 21 days, the food that fed the men who had just changed the history of human civilization was prepared by Stouffers. The company's advertising team understood immediately what this meant for the brand. The tagline, "Everybody who's been to the moon is eating Stouffers," ran across the country. It was the most audacious possible statement of quality. If the food was good enough for astronauts on the most scrutinized public mission in American history, it was good enough for anyone. The same endorsement was extended to Apollo 12 and Apollo 14, cementing Stouffer's relationship with NASA as a supplier of choice for post-mission quarantine food. The frozen food plant in Solon was being operated at peak capacity. The hotel division was acquiring prestigious properties. The restaurant chain continued its expansion. By any outward measure, the corporation that Abraham and Lena Stouffer had started with $15,000 was at the zenith of its power and reputation. But here is what the ledgers were already showing, and what the family name could not prevent. Litton Industries was having second thoughts. In 1973, Litton sold the entirety of the Stouffer operation, all three divisions, restaurants, hotels, and frozen foods, to Nestlé SA, the Swiss-based food processing company headquartered in Vevey, Switzerland, which was at that point the world's largest food company. The purchase price and exact terms were not publicly disclosed. What was disclosed was the structural fact of what had just happened. The company, founded by Abraham and Lena Stouffer in Cleveland's Arcade in 1922, built by their sons into an American institution that had fed astronauts and opened rooftop restaurants in the country's great cities, was now a subsidiary of a Swiss conglomerate with global operations spanning dozens of countries and dozens of product categories. Vernon Stouffer died on July 26, 1974, at the age of 72, from a heart attack. He had lived to see the sale. He had not lived to see what came after it. If you're finding this story fascinating, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. It really helps us continue bringing you these deep dives into the stories behind American institutions. 1978 to 1984, Solon, Ohio. Almost a decade passed inside the Stouffer's Food Research Division before a single product emerged that would demonstrate beyond any remaining doubt that the company understood what American consumers wanted. The research began in the late 1970s. Focus groups confirmed what anyone paying attention to the culture already knew. The diet food category was exploding. But the actual products were terrible. They tasted terrible. They looked terrible. The portions were insulting. The packaging was clinical and joyless. Every frozen diet meal on the market communicated deprivation rather than satisfaction. Stouffer's did the opposite. They spent nearly a decade developing a product line they eventually called Lean Cuisine, launched in 1981, built on the premise that a diet meal did not have to feel like punishment. The meals were single-serving entrees with a maximum of 300 calories. They contained generous amounts of vegetables and used extra herbs for flavor to compensate for the reduced fat. The branding was developed by advertising executive George Lois, the same man credited with the "I Want My MTV" campaign, who named the line Lean Cuisine, a name that was direct, confident, and completely unlike anything else in the freezer aisle. The launch exceeded every projection Stouffer's had made. Lean Cuisine sales tripled the company's own forecasts in the first year. Over 300,000 copies of a promotional booklet entitled On the Way to Being Lean were distributed alongside the initial launch. The single-dish entree category, which had been flat for 2 consecutive years, recorded its first growth since the late 1970s on the back of Lean Cuisine's introduction. Stouffer's share of the $500 million frozen food market jumped from 33%, already the dominant position in the industry, to 46%. By 1982, the Gaffney, South Carolina plant that had opened in 1980 specifically to provide additional frozen food production capacity was being expanded by 47%. Workers at both Gaffney and Solon were putting in 6-day weeks to keep store shelves stocked. By 1984, Lean Cuisine was outselling Weight Watchers frozen entrees 3-1 and had captured nearly half of the American frozen entree market. It was the commercial peak. Stouffer's was the dominant force in the frozen food aisle. The hotels were expanding. The name was on 68 restaurants and 40 properties. The product that had started with Lena Stouffer's apple pie in a Cleveland arcade had evolved into the most powerful brand in the freezer case. But here is what was already in motion that year, and what the executives celebrating the Lean Cuisine numbers had no way to fully account for. The market they had just created was going to attract competition from companies with resources that Stouffer's, even under Nestlé's ownership, was not positioned to match indefinitely. And the frozen food consumer was developing habits and expectations that would eventually demand something the legacy brand was not built to provide. They were celebrating. The clock had already started. 1984 to 1990, the frozen food aisle, America. The success of Lean Cuisine was one of the most widely analyzed product launches in the American food industry during the 1980s. Every major competitor studied it. Every major competitor responded to it. And the combined weight of those responses arrived with a velocity that Stouffer's was not fast enough to absorb. Kraft General Foods moved first with Budget Gourmet, a line of frozen entrees positioned at a price point below Lean Cuisine. Lean Cuisine, targeting consumers who wanted diet-style convenience without the premium pricing. Budget Gourmet did not match Lean Cuisine for quality, but it did not need to. It captured the cost-conscious segment that Lean Cuisine had pulled into the frozen diet category and then not fully locked in through price loyalty. ConAgra's Healthy Choice arrived and did far more damage. Healthy Choice was positioned not merely as a diet food, but as a genuinely health-conscious alternative, with lower sodium, lower fat, and a clean ingredients messaging that resonated in a cultural moment increasingly focused on the connection between food choices and long-term health outcomes. By the late 1980s, the word healthy had more power in the frozen food aisle than the word lean. H.J. Heinz attached the Weight Watchers name to dozens of products, flooding the diet-adjacent segment with brand recognition borrowed from the most recognizable weight loss program in America. By 1987, the combined effect was measurable and sobering. Weight Watchers, Healthy Choice, and the other competitors had reduced Lean Cuisine's share of the single-dish frozen dinner market to just 13%, from nearly half the market to 13% in 3 years. The frozen food empire that had seemed invulnerable in 1984 was now scrambling. Stouffer's response was a product called Right Course, a low-fat, low-cholesterol line designed to compete with Healthy Choice on the health credentials that consumers were increasingly prioritizing. The product was supported by extensive consumer research and launched with genuine ambition. It lasted 17 months in national distribution before being pulled. Market share, 1%. Observers inside and outside the company attributed the failure to multiple factors: premium pricing that the product's positioning did not justify, poor shelf placement, dishes that were considered too exotic for mainstream frozen food buyers, and most fatally, a name that communicated nothing as memorable or aspirational as Lean Cuisine had. Meanwhile, the frozen food aisle itself was changing in ways that no single product launch could address. The broader American consumer was beginning to question not just what they were eating, but where it had come from, what was in it, and whether a product that had been manufactured in a factory and frozen for months could be considered genuinely good food. The organic movement was emerging. Fresh prepared meals at grocery store deli counters were proliferating. The cultural authority of convenience was beginning to erode. Stouffer's was still the market leader in several frozen food categories. But the comfortable dominance of the early 1980s was gone, and what had replaced it was something more precarious. A holding pattern sustained by brand loyalty in a category where brand loyalty was weakening. 1990 to 1996. Nestlé, USA headquarters, and various hotel lobbies. By 1990, the Stouffer name was attached to 68 restaurants and 40 hotels and resorts. This sounds like strength. In the context of what Nestlé USA had decided it needed to be, it was a distraction. Nestlé, the world's largest food company, he had acquired Stouffer's in 1973 because of the food. The restaurants and hotels had come along with the purchase, and for nearly 2 decades Nestlé had allowed them to operate and even expand under the Stouffer brand. But by the early 1990s, Nestlé's corporate strategy was becoming increasingly focused. They were a food company, not a hospitality company, not a restaurant group. The hotel and restaurant divisions represented a tiny fraction of Nestlé's global revenues and required a disproportionate amount of management attention relative to their contribution. In October of 1992, Stouffer Restaurants, 68 locations operating under various brand names, was spun off from Nestlé and purchased by a corporate management group composed of former Stouffer's executives, who rebranded the operation as Select Restaurants, Inc. The sale was completed at a moment when the restaurant industry was itself navigating significant headwinds. Many of the locations that Select Restaurants inherited from Stouffer's closed within the following decade. As of the present day, Select Restaurants operates 8 locations, from 68 to 8. The last Stouffer's restaurant in the traditional sense had already quietly closed in late 1983, when Nestlé had begun scaling back the original restaurant chain concept. The rooftop restaurants, the top of the Sixes in Manhattan, the top of the Hub in Boston, the top of the Town in Cleveland, were sold with the broader restaurant division. The top of the Sixes, which had opened in 1958 at the pinnacle of Manhattan's 666 Fifth Avenue, was sold to Select Restaurants and ultimately closed in September of 1996, another relic of a bygone New York era. The hotel division went next. In 1993, Nestlé announced its intention to sell the Stouffer Hotels Group to the New World Development Company, the Hong Kong-based conglomerate owned by billionaire Cheng Yu-tung, which also operated the Renaissance and Ramada International Hotel brands. The transaction was completed by 1996 for a reported $1.5 billion. The Stouffer Hotels brand was retired. The properties became Renaissance Hotels. See, the Stouffer's Inn on the Square in Cleveland, which had been the Hotel Cleveland and was a landmark of the city, became the Renaissance Cleveland Hotel. Stouffer Hotels had, by the time of the sale, won virtually every major award the travel industry offered. The 39 properties and resorts represented some of the most prestigious lodging in the country. And then the name came off every door, every awning, every piece of stationery. In its place, Renaissance. The Stouffer identity that had been built over 3 decades of hotel operations was absorbed, renamed, and erased. 1993 to 2017, Solon, Ohio. What remained after the sale of the restaurants and the hotels was the frozen food business. It was the most profitable of the 3 divisions, the most scalable, and the most compatible with Nestlé's global food strategy. Stouffer Foods Corporation was fully integrated into Nestlé USA as a division in 1998, first under the name Nestlé USA Frozen Foods, then renamed Nestlé Prepared Foods in 2000, and eventually Nestlé Meals Division in 2024. The Solon, Ohio campus. That 42-acre frozen food facility that had been built in 1968 as the most advanced of its kind in the world, remained the heart of the operation. The facility employed more than 850 people in its production operations alone, producing Stouffers and Lean Cuisine frozen meals daily for distribution across the country. The Gaffney, South Carolina plant, opened in 1980, was expanded and continued as a second major production center. These were real, in working industrial facilities producing millions of meals that Americans genuinely purchased and ate, but the company that had given those meals their identity, the company that had connected them to a restaurant tradition, to a family name, to the idea that someone with standards had decided this recipe was good enough to be called Stouffers, was gone. Not the brand name. The brand name remained. What was gone was the independent entity that had made the brand name mean something specific. Former employees described the transition to Nestlé ownership with a clarity that is difficult to argue with. One, writing years later, captured the shift precisely. By 1993, it was all over, and the Stouffer feeling was gone. At one time, that company had amazing panache in the NE Ohio area, in and around the country. The word panache is not the word someone uses to describe a corporation. It is the word someone uses to describe a personality. And the Stouffer Corporation had one, built over decades of family-driven decision-making and quality obsession, that did not survive intact into the era of Swiss multinational management. The brand continued its legal and regulatory challenges. In 1991, the Federal Trade Commission issued a complaint against Stouffer Foods for allegedly misrepresenting the sodium content of Lean Cuisine entrees by describing them as low in sodium. In 2003, Applebee's sued Stouffers for trademark infringement related to a 1997 marketing term, recraum skillet sensations, which Applebee's claimed it had established first and which Stouffers had used for its own product line. These were the kinds of disputes that large food companies navigated routinely, but they were a long way from the world of Lena Stouffer's Dutch apple pie. Meanwhile, the frozen food market continued its transformation. By the second decade of the 21st century, Lean Cuisine, which had generated approximately $987 million in annual revenue as recently as 2013, was in decline. Sales dropped roughly 20% over the 2 years preceding 2015. The cultural authority of diet-branded frozen food was eroding as consumers moved toward fresh meal delivery services, grocery store prepared foods, and a broader skepticism about heavily processed products marketed under health claims. The frozen food category in general had begun losing American consumers in the 2010s, with unit sales declining approximately 2% annually. 2023, Toronto, Canada. In January of 2023, Nestlé Canada announced its intention to wind down and exit the frozen meals and pizza business in the Canadian market within 6 months. The announcement was covered by Canadian grocer and food industry publications. It was not a major American news event, but it was the most precise possible indicator of the brand's trajectory. The only other country that had ever carried Stouffer's products, a market the brand had served for decades, was closing. The explanation from Nestlé Canada was corporate and clean. The decision was part of a broader portfolio rationalization, a refocusing on categories where the company had greater strategic advantage. These are the words that large corporations use when they exit markets. They are accurate as far as they go, and they communicate nothing about what the market's exit means from the perspective of the brand's history. From that perspective, what the Canadian exit meant was that Stouffers was now, for the first time in its existence as a commercial entity, a product available in a single country. Did the same pandemic that had caused frozen food sales to spike dramatically in 2020, as Americans rediscovered the convenience and value of meals they could heat at home, had also revealed the structural strengths and weaknesses of the frozen food sector in sharp relief. Nestlé invested $100 million in an expansion at the Gaffney factory during this period to meet surging demand. The Stouffer's brand in the American market was ranked #1 in both single-serve and multi-serve frozen dinners as recently as February 2021. The brand was not dying in America, but it was contracting globally, and the contraction was not reversing. In 2024, Nestlé Meals introduced something called Stouffer Supreme, a line of shelf-stable dried macaroni and cheese products, the first non-frozen items ever sold under the Stouffer's name. The significance of this moment deserves a pause. The brand that had been defined by its restaurant-quality frozen food for 70 years, that had built its identity entirely in the freezer aisle, was now selling boxed dried pasta in the ambient grocery section. It was competing directly with Kraft, the brand that had dominated that shelf space for as long as most living Americans could remember. We're halfway through this incredible story. If you're enjoying it, don't forget to like and subscribe. Every person who subscribes helps us keep doing this. Present day, Solon, Ohio, and Gaffney, South Carolina. The Nestlé campus in Solon, Ohio, at 30,003 Bainbridge Road, is a working industrial complex. The frozen food production facility that was built in 1968 remains operational, producing Stouffer's and Lean Cuisine products for the American market. More than 850 people work there in production alone. Additional corporate functions of the Nestlé USA division are housed in a renovated office building on the campus. The facility is real, active, and consequential in the employment landscape of suburban Cleveland. The 144,000 square foot Nestlé Research and Development Center, completed on the Solon campus in 2015 at a cost of $50 million, represents a genuine and substantial investment in the future of food science. The development center was designated as a global hub for advancing frozen and chilled food technologies. It is a serious facility staffed by serious scientists working on real problems. None of this is trivial. The economic impact of the Solon campus on the city and region, documented in a 2022 celebration of the brand's 100th anniversary, is genuine and significant. Solon Mayor Eddie Krause described the relationship between the city and Nestlé as a great partnership. The corporate representatives who attended the centennial events spoke with evident pride about the brand's history and the legacy it represented. But something is missing from the campus in Solon that no amount of investment in food science or production technology can restore. There is no one named Stouffer making any decisions. There is no family with a stake in the outcome beyond their job title. The governance of what happens to the brand, what markets it enters or exits, what products it launches or discontinues, what the name eventually becomes. All of that belongs to a Swiss corporate structure that manages hundreds of brands across dozens of countries and views the Stouffer's name as one asset among many in a portfolio. Vernon Stouffer, who had once traveled secretly to his own restaurants to check whether the food met his standard, is gone. The restaurants are gone. The hotels are gone. The rooftop dining rooms, where you could order duck à l'orange in Cleveland or look down at Fifth Avenue in New York while waiting for your table, are gone. What remains is the box, the frozen lasagna, the macaroni and cheese, the Salisbury steak. These are good products. They are made with genuine care in well-run facilities by people who take their work seriously. But they are products. They are not a company. They are not a family. They are not a personality. 1946 to the present. The American freezer aisle. The tragic irony at the center of the Stouffer's story is that the frozen food division, The afterthought that Wally Blankenship created by accident at the Shaker Square restaurant in 1946 was the thing that survived longest, and the thing that survived by consuming everything else. When customers at the Shaker Square restaurant began asking to take Stouffer's food home to reheat, they were not asking to replace the restaurant experience. They were asking to extend it, to have something of the quality they had just experienced available on a Tuesday night when they could not get to a Stouffer's location. The frozen food was supposed to be supplemental to the restaurant. The restaurant was supposed to be the primary relationship. What happened over the following decades was an inversion so gradual that it was invisible while it was occurring. As frozen food distribution scaled up, as supermarkets expanded, as the customer base for the frozen product grew far beyond the customer base for the restaurant became the smaller part of the story. By the time Nestlé acquired Stouffer's in 1973, the frozen food business was the reason they had made the purchase. The restaurants and hotels were assets to be evaluated and eventually divested. The frozen food was the prize. And so the very success of the frozen food division guaranteed the dissolution of everything else the Stouffer name had stood for. The more successful the boxes in the freezer became, the less necessary, and eventually the less compatible. The full-service restaurants and luxury hotels were with the corporate entity that owned them. Success in the freezer aisle required the efficiency, scale, and global distribution infrastructure of a company like Nestlé. That same corporate scale had no use for 68 restaurant locations or 40 hotel properties that each required individual management, local relationships, and a hospitality expertise that food manufacturing did not develop. The restaurants were sold. The hotels were sold. The name that had meant good food, gracious service, and an honest commitment to quality in a dining room became the name on a cardboard box in the freezer section. Both are legitimate uses of a brand identity. But they are not the same thing. And the people who grew up eating at Stouffer's restaurants, who celebrated birthdays at the top of the town overlooking the lights of Cleveland, who ordered room service in Stouffer's hotels in Washington and Tampa and the Virgin Islands, experienced the transition as a loss rather than a continuation. The brand had defeated every enemy except the one it created itself, its own frozen success, 2015 to the present, the American grocery store. The category that Stouffer's had dominated for 3 decades did not disappear when the brand's cultural centrality faded. It transformed around other priorities, other brands, other consumer expectations that Stouffer's was not nimble enough to shape. Fresh meal kit delivery services, Blue Apron, HelloFresh, and Green Chef emerged in the early 2010s and captured the consumer who wanted the convenience of having ingredients arrive at their door, but wanted the sense of participation that cooking provided. They did not primarily compete with Stouffer's in the freezer aisle, but they captured the attention and spending of the demographic that might previously have defaulted to a premium frozen dinner. Grocery store deli sections proliferated with rotisserie chickens, prepared side dishes, and complete dinner solutions that could be purchased fresh on a Tuesday evening and brought home to be eaten within the hour. These products existed in a completely different psychological category from frozen food. They felt temporary, immediate, and somehow less industrial, even when the actual nutritional profile or ingredient quality was not meaningfully different. Amy's Kitchen, established in 1987 and growing through the 90s and 2000s, built a brand identity in the frozen food section based explicitly on organic ingredients, non-GMO sourcing, and transparent labeling. It captured the health-conscious consumer who had once been Lean Cuisine's target and had grown more demanding about what that term actually meant. Stouffer's, with its legacy of rich, comforting, portion-generous meals, had no easy answer to the organic movement's demands. The Lean Cuisine brand attempted a significant rebranding in 2015, A moving away from diet culture language toward a wellness messaging that proved awkward for a product historically associated with calorie restriction. The rebranding generated commentary, but not a sustained reversal of the sales decline. By 2023, when Canada exited the Stouffer's market entirely, the frozen dinner category was growing again, driven by the pandemic-era rediscovery of home cooking and frozen convenience. But the growth was distributed across a fragmented landscape of hundreds of brands, private labels, and meal kit hybrids that had not existed when Stouffer's was building its dominance. The company that had invented the premium frozen entree category was now one brand among many in a market it could no longer claim to define. 2022. Solon, Ohio. In 2022, when the Stouffer's brand celebrated its centennial, 100 years from the moment Abraham and Lena Stouffer converted that dairy stand in the Cleveland Arcade into a lunch counter serving buttermilk and pie. The celebration was genuine. The Nestlé campus in Solon hosted events. The Cleveland Jewish News covered the centennial with warmth and detail. Todd Muller, senior marketing manager of the Stouffer's brand at Nestlé Professional, spoke about the legacy with evident pride and respect for what the founding family had created. The thing we're really celebrating, this 100 years, is we've been contributing to food service for 100 years, Mueller said. I just think that history of innovation and flexibility and saying, hey, what do people want? What are we missing? How do we keep people well fed is a really cool legacy. The language is careful and sincere, but it is also the language of an archivist describing something that has been preserved rather than an executive describing something that is still fully alive in its original form. Contributing to food service is a different thing from defining food service. Innovation and flexibility are real virtues, but they are not the same as the particular, personal, uncompromising quality obsession that Vernon Stouffer carried with him when he traveled secretly to his own restaurants to test the food. The centennial was a backward-looking event by its nature. Centennials always are. They celebrate survival and duration, which are real achievements, but they are also inherently acknowledgments that a great deal of time has passed, and that the present bears only a structural resemblance to the beginning. Abraham Stouffer had started with $15,000 and a Dutch apple pie. The centennial was being celebrated by a Swiss multinational with annual sales of $92 billion that happened to own the Stouffer's name. Both facts are true simultaneously. The distance between them is the story. Return now to that summer of 1969, to the quarantine facility in Houston, to the astronauts eating Stouffer's meals after coming back from the moon. Three things were true at that moment, and understanding all three at once produces the full picture of what this story contains. First, Stouffer's was genuinely great. The food that Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, and Michael Collins ate during their 21-day quarantine was chosen because it was the best option available, because a company founded on a grandmother's apple pie had built a 70-year tradition of taking food seriously in a way that its competitors had not. That tradition was real. It produced real meals that real people loved, from the macaroni and cheese that became a fixture in American freezers to the spinach soufflé that Chef Louis Satmarie helped develop in the early 1960s. The quality was not a marketing claim. It was a fact. Second, the moment of the moon quarantine represented the precise peak of Stouffer's institutional wholeness. The restaurants were thriving. The hotels were expanding. The frozen food was ascendant. The name meant something unified. Not just a product, but a company with a character. It holds a philosophy and a family identity that had survived 2 generations of active management. Within 4 years, the family would be entirely out of the picture. Within 20 years, the restaurants would be sold. Within 24 years, the hotels would be gone. Third, the thing that made them think they were untouchable the frozen food, was the thing that accelerated the dissolution of everything else. The frozen food was so good and so commercially powerful that it attracted a buyer who only wanted the frozen food. Nestlé did not acquire Stouffer's because it wanted to run 68 restaurants. It wanted the factory, the brand name in the freezer aisle, and the research capability that had produced Lean Cuisine. The restaurants and the hotels were assets to be managed and eventually unwound. The frozen food was the strategy. The three implicit ironies at the heart of this story reveal themselves only in hindsight. The first, that the greatest restaurant the Stouffer family ever built was not a restaurant at all. It was a cardboard box. The second, that the hospitality empire they constructed across 40 hotel properties and 68 dining rooms was ultimately dismantled in the service of a box of lasagna. The third, that the family whose motto was, "Everybody is somebody at Stouffer's," became, for the multinational that bought them, nobody. Their name retained, their identity consumed. Walk through a grocery store today and find the Stouffer's section in the frozen food aisle. The lasagna is there. The macaroni and cheese is there. The Salisbury steak, the fettuccine alfredo, the French bread pizza, all there, be in the same orange and white packaging that generations of Americans have recognized since the 1960s. The product exists, the name survives, the brand is maintained. But the irreversible moment in this story was not the sale to Litton in 1967, or the sale to Nestlé in 1973, or the sale of the restaurants in 1992, or the sale of the hotels in 1993, or Canada's exit in 2023. The irreversible moment was the summer of 1969, when Stouffer's was feeding the men who had been to the moon, and everyone who mattered was watching, and the company was precisely as complete and as proud as it would ever be. Everything after that was the completion of the tragedy's structure. Not shocking, just final.